A series of explosions destroyed a whole row of pylons. Under normal circumstances, even if something had happened to the magnetic monorail train, the damper fields would have kicked in, gently slowing the train and preventing any possible debris from flying around. But this time, the emergency field generators were shut down, and the 18 cars, like a projectile fired from a magnetic slingshot, flew off the track at 170 kilometers per hour and crashed into the sullen gray building of the city library. I wondered why we tend to build libraries that look like radioactive waste storage facilities. Does a repository of culture and knowledge have to be as unattractive as possible from an aesthetic point of view? Okay, I realize that droids have different ideas about aesthetics, although if you remember some symphonies written by droids, you can argue about that. But the city council is at least half human. There are plenty of talented humans in architecture bureaus too. Damn it, I almost bit my tongue in frustration. Even if you're not immersed in this filth, your attention still picks up some scraps here and there. They're stored somewhere on the dusty shelves of your memory, and then, suddenly, the same scraps you used to laugh at are crawling to the surface. But they've grown stronger, glued together into fat, vile worms. Droids are displacing humans. Droids are taking over. Droids are imposing their values. The saddest thing about it is that I'm just forced into this filth, and not up to my neck, but up to the top of my head. "Let's go," Magnus said, a ridiculous pseudonym for a native of New Japan. But our cell leader deliberately chose it to honor an old comic book hero who fought hostile robots. Well, if he used fists like that funny guy in tights and boots, nobody would really care. But our Magnus prefers explosives and doesn't make much difference between droids and humans. The main thing is to spread fear and insecurity, and then the people will rise on their own. That's his principle. Unfortunately, I can't tie the bastard up and bring him to the safety service. He's our only link to the cult leadership, and until I follow that link to the heart of the tangle, I can't touch him. If that doesn't shake them up, they're even dumber than I thought, May said. As she spoke, her scar tightened the skin on the left side of her face, making her look even creepier. To me, refusing reconstructive surgery didn't seem like a protest against society, but evidence of dormant stubbornness and stupidity. But I didn't tell her that, of course. But you're right. We should leave anyway. The SS will come here soon anyway, like flies on. Anyway, let's get out of here. SS, that's what she called my colleagues in the safety service. Firefighters, medics, and other rescue personnel. Those who were always ready to help if disaster struck. People and droids, who are now, by the grace of this noble underground, were forced to remember again the ancient and not very pleasant profession of police and counterintelligence, and in some exceptional cases, such as mine for example, the even less pleasant profession of a spy. Our small group was located about a kilometer from the crash site, on the top technical floor of a large hotel, closed for reconstruction. From here, we had a good view of the same section of the monorail, into whose supports we had placed the charges from the homemade explosives Magnus and May had cooked up in the basement of our country house the previous night. God, what a waste of resources, and if I hadn't been able to alert my contact 2 days ago about the exact time and place of the attack, hundreds, if not thousands, of people and droids could have died here. Of course, Magnus and May didn't know that no one was on the train or in the library. My colleagues in the service did their best to ensure no one was hurt. Beneath the monorail was a warehouse district that wasn't very crowded in its best times. It wasn't a very convenient place, and at least half was empty. Under various pretexts, the remaining employees of the area were removed today. The library was quietly closed, ostensibly due to an unscheduled check of the electrical systems. The monorail was the most difficult, but they managed to deal with that too. The main train was held back a bit at one of the stations, and instead, a specially prepared dummy train with only dummies and old decommissioned droid bodies inside was released from a sideline. With real terrorists of the old days before unification, such a trick would not have worked, of course. Back then, in a world filled with violence and meanness, even criminals had their own intelligence service. I carefully removed the camera and its powerful optics from the tripod, disassembled it, and put everything in its proper cases. Magnus and May, meanwhile, were destroying all traces of our presence in the room as best they could. Of course, the mini-drones with DNA sensors would detect it anyway, but you needed a reason to use them. If no one ever suspected that the perpetrators of the disaster might be hiding in the building, then no one would use tracking technology here. The safety service didn't have the resources to search all the buildings within a kilometer radius of the disaster site. I remembered that DNA sensors were designed to track animal migrations in sanctuaries and search for possible invasive species that had come to Earth with ships that had been poorly processed in the quarantine zone. What those psychopaths have gotten us to, that we use this technology to hunt people. We finished almost simultaneously. After picking up equipment bags, we took the personnel elevator down to the first floor and got into our cargo skimmer, parked in the underground garage. Typically, the place was full of other contractors' cars, but it was a holiday, and there was no one there but us. Of course, Magnus had taken precautions. The car bore the name and logo of a panoramic window fake repair company, and May had hacked into the general contractor's database and put the Phantom Company on the list of those allowed on the site. Only when we were already on Interstate 5, speeding north toward the country house that served as our operations base, Magnus finally broke the silence. "Well, friends, congratulations on a successful action," he said. "Jeremiah, May, you can be proud of yourselves. Today we have made another, and hopefully big enough step toward the future freedom of mankind." I was glad Magnus and May were in the front seat of the van and couldn't see my face. Sure, I'd been psychologically trained, but I was afraid if they saw my face at that moment, my career as an undercover agent would be over. It all started 2 years ago. We understand it now, but at that time, no one had any idea that something was happening in the world that could lead to unpleasant consequences. The first signs were the articles, essays, and materials that appeared in large numbers on the hyperweb, full of ranting that mankind should return to its biological origins, revise the results of the Great Unification, cleanse itself from the artificial layer, and so on. In general, there was nothing unusual in this. Such nonsense was constantly circulating somewhere on the fringes of marginal, pseudo-intellectual circles. But then, a wave of such publications arose, and their tone rapidly became more aggressive and radical. Eventually, the cleanup started, while trying to trace the authors. But if the first task was fulfilled, which, strangely enough, was helped by those same marginals who were frightened by the scale of events and the fact that someone was rapidly pushing them out of their cozy little information bubble, all the tracing attempts went nowhere. All references to the original sources were lost in the wilds of the hyperweb, in remote burner virtual nodes and other dead ends. Then, the acts of sabotage began. At first, they were virtual. Attacks on service sites, attempts to introduce malware supposedly capable of affecting the droids' minds, and shutdowns of local networks. At this point, it became clear that humans were behind all of this, as the attempts were clumsy enough that the droids that kept the hyperweb in order had no trouble thwarting them. And that's when the unknowns moved into direct action. I remember well the first days of confusion and terror after the terrorists blew up the Svalbard data center, one of the most important network nodes in the Arctic belt, serving several large floating cities and orbital settlements. The explosion killed several dozen humans and droids, and it shocked everyone. Even despite the very obvious evidence pointing to malicious intent, and what could be more obvious than the remains of an improvised explosive device. No one could believe anyone was capable of such a thing. Wars, terrorism, violence. For all of us, it was all something from the distant past, horrible pages from history books that you both believe and try not to remember, because you are surrounded by a completely different, safe world. At first, the main version was the assumption that what happened was the work of some mentally sick person, and the investigation was engaged in the medical department of the safety service. But after several terrorist attacks in different parts of the Earth, it became clear that we are talking about the underground terrorist net. And then statements from the biological resistance movement started appearing online, calling on all humans to destroy the mechanical overlords and overthrow the shackles of electronic slavery. That's when we had to pull old, dusty police and counterintelligence manuals out of the archives and start these spy games. A jolt snapped me out of my gloomy musings. Magnus hit the brakes rather sharply, and May hissed a foul swear word through her teeth. I looked out the side window of the skimmer. On the side of the highway was a powerful vehicle of a distinctive orange color with a large blue safety service emblem. 2 persons were standing next to the machine, a tall man in uniform overalls of the same colors, and a droid whose uniform was limited to a small badge on its breastplate. Droids didn't really like to repaint their hulls in different colors. It was a big decision for them, about as serious as getting a tattoo for a human. Judging by the augmented reality goggles on the man's head and the top of the droid's body, with the mounted scanner turning evenly to follow the passing skimmers, they were recording the registration data of the entire traffic stream. We had nothing to worry about. Our skimmer's register was clean. But May grumbled hatefully as she looked at the patrol. Damn fascists! All they want is to control everything and everyone, to put us under a total hood. I thought that no one would have thought of such nonsense until you had the whole world on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Nobody even knew how to organize it. However, it was clear that such considerations did not occur among the terrorists themselves. Naturally, I did not say that out loud, but mumbled some nonsense about the necessity of destroying the world of universal surveillance. Apparently, I'd gotten pretty emotional under the influence of my dislike for May, because Magnus gave me a quick glance over his shoulder and nodded approvingly. Good thinking, Jeremiah. Keep it up, he said. If we had more intelligent young men like you, we'd be in a good place. A few more actions and the tyranny will be shaken. And that's not just my personal opinion, you know. You're in good standing with our HQ, Jeremiah, so you got a big future, boy. Just give me a link to your HQ, I thought, and we'll deal with that big future of yours. Just give me that. Skimmer turned off the federal highway onto a narrow road that, winding between small lakes, went deep into the sparsely populated area where the country house that served as our cell's base stood. I tiredly closed my eyes, waiting for us to arrive at our destination. Another day, another crime. Hopefully, there are no casualties today, but how much destruction, how much senseless chaos. I must endure to the end. I must get to the center of this devil's web and stop whoever is behind it. Otherwise, all the sacrifices and all the effort would be in vain. Usually, in the intervals between actions, I lived in a country house, doing all sorts of household chores. To maintain the semblance of normal rural life, there were greenhouses with herbs and an orchard with apples, pears, and modified peaches, so there was plenty of work. The workshop where we were preparing for the next action was located in the basement. Magnus had enlarged it before I arrived and brought in a lot of equipment and materials, which he replenished occasionally when he went out of the area for a few days. This secluded way of life posed some problems, especially at first, because I had to meet my contact somehow. There was no communication by the universal comm or access to the hyperweb. The manor was under tight electronic security. It was a rare case when the paranoia of technophobes turned out to be justified in its own way. However, in the end, I managed to find a way out. To avoid attracting unnecessary attention and not spoiling the cover of the cell, we had to at least sometimes sell the fruits of our rural labor. I was a good candidate for that job, since Magnus mainly was traveling when he wasn't working in the basement, and May, with her horribly mangled face, wasn't much of a market vendor. My contact found me at the market, and now he bought apples and pears from me regularly, ostensibly for his little pastry business. Though, why ostensibly? The safety service actually had to provide the money and open a small pastry shop on the outskirts of town for such an occasion. If Magnus was the brain of the cell and the link to the resistance leadership, May was its soul and emotions. The gruesome scar that turned the entire left side of her face into a ghastly purple mask was a result of the stratoplane crash she and her family had been involved in a few years ago. Her husband and 2 children died, as did most of the passengers, including 12 droids. And May walked out of the hospital 2 months later, refusing reconstructive plastic surgery. She blamed the disaster on a crew of droids who didn't care about the passengers, though they all died too. And she wore the scar proudly as proof of her righteousness. Her trauma, understandable and compassionate, could have been dealt with in 6 months of therapy. But May's misfortune was that she crossed paths with Magnus, and after that, she had only one road: the road to hell. To keep my cover story and keep feeding the resistance disinformation, the safety service conducted a complex operation after our action on the monorail. All news channels reported many casualties in the crash, without giving the exact number and names. Since such information was protected by privacy laws anyway, the anonymity of the dead and injured didn't alert Magnus and May. Judging by the fact that Magnus hadn't put in place any additional conspiracy measures, the resistance leadership also remained in the dark. I was proud. At last, we, the ordinary firefighters and rescue workers in our very recent past, had managed to beat the damned terrorists, but we still couldn't reach the leadership. Theoretically, we could have Magnus and May arrested tomorrow. The evidence against them was overwhelming. So far, however, we hadn't been able to crack any of the detained resistance agents, although at least 2 of them must have had connections to the leadership. In the violent and chaotic times before unification, when humanity was still divided into nations at war with each other, this testimony would have been beaten out of them, or they would have been drugged with some sort of truth drug. But now, there was not a single human or droid in the entire safety service willing to commit such a heinous, barbaric act, even if it was for the most noble of reasons. Even I was in for extended recovery therapy after the operation was over, and an even longer observation period in case the poison of willingness to violence did penetrate my mind. Our cell's next action was the explosion of a transcontinental passenger stratoplane, which finally gave me a chance to accomplish my mission. As usual, Magnus didn't fill me in on the details of the action. My role was to stand behind a temporary counter at a small farmer's market near the airport and be ready to throw all our stuff into a cargo skimmer and take off with Magnus and May, Honestly, I was fine with that. I could let my contact know if things didn't go according to plan, though I was calm. I'd been able to transfer the information a week before the action, and the safety service was fully prepared for any surprises. However, everything went as well as it could. Magnus and May, dressed in the uniforms of airport technicians, came out of the service entrance right on schedule. We quietly loaded my fake farm stuff, although why fake? In 3 months, I'd gotten used to being a market trader farmer and was even beginning to enjoy it, and left just as quietly. The news of the stratoplane explosion was broadcast on all the news channels when we were already at home. I was disgusted to see the genuine joy, literally ecstasy, that lit up May's face at the news that none of the passengers or crew had survived. 111 people and 86 droids, according to the news. And I had to leave the room immediately to keep from giving myself away. Of course, no one was on the stratoplane, and the stratoplane, which had been given up to the resistance for destruction, had already reached the end of its useful life and would have been decommissioned in a month. However, it was still hard for me to understand these people. I was standing on the porch, staring at the dark sky. The season was winding down in the northern part of Greenland, where our house was located, and the polar night was approaching, when the door creaked behind me, and I heard Magnus's heavy footsteps. "You did great, Jeremiah," he said, standing beside me. "I've been keeping a close eye on you the whole time and reporting your progress to HQ." I tensed. What's he getting at? They want to meet with you," Magnus said. I noted his little caveat. So was it he or they? It seemed that Magnus, for all his outward equanimity, could still be agitated and make little mistakes. I tried my best to feign rapturous admiration. "Really? I mean, it's not like I ever wanted a career in the Resistance. I'm just for the right cause. I'm doing my part the best I can." "I know," Magnus said. "That's why it was decided to set up a meeting for you. We'll go there tomorrow. We must leave early in the morning, so you'd better not stay up too late tonight." I'm so excited." This time, I didn't have to put on much of an act. I was happy. Magnus clapped me on the back. "That's good. I'll wake you up tomorrow." And he went into the house without another word. It would have been nice if I could have somehow notified my contact of the sudden breakthrough, but Magnus left me no chance. There was no way I could leave the manor at night, especially with such plans for tomorrow. A worm of slight paranoia stirred in my soul, but I suppressed it. Magnus was probably just following standard security protocols and had no additional suspicions about me. Magnus came for me very early indeed, barely past 4 in the morning. After a quick snack, we got into the small skimmer and set off, leaving May to keep watch over the manor. I knew she hated tending the garden and greenhouse, but the fruits were almost harvested, so she didn't have much to do. I thought we'd be heading south on the federal highway toward the capital, but to my surprise, after a few dozen kilometers, Magnus turned onto a highway that led to the Canadian Arctic agglomeration, which, while still one of the most populated places on the planet, was a vast expanse of land. The skimmer was picking up speed rapidly. We were already in the outermost lane. Damn. If Magnus wanted to get to the Pacific coast, wouldn't it have been easier to take a stratoplane? Not that it bothered me that much, but what was the point of driving a skimmer across the continent for a good day or so when the same distance could be covered in a couple hours? Turns out, I was worried for nothing. After 3 hours of driving through cities, rural communes, fields, seas, and tunnels, under lakes and bays, Magnus slowed down and turned off the highway. We first passed a couple of small towns, and then the surrounding countryside became more and more desolate. I noticed that the pavement quality was also getting worse with each kilometer, so the hover cushions of the skimmer soon had a hard time keeping the car in balance. Magnus, however, drove the skimmer calmly, paying no attention to anything. Obviously, this was not the first time he had traveled this way. It was such a pity that modern technology made any kind of tracking completely pointless. A small device could easily jam and detect any bug. That's how we lost some of the first agents we tried to embed in the resistance, and after that, it was decided to abandon such methods so as not to expose the whole operation, and me too, to unnecessary risk. I did have a couple of trumps of my own up my sleeve, but it hadn't come to that yet. Meanwhile, the road made another turn toward a big mountain, and a moment later, the skimmer stopped at a large rubble-strewn space in which an ancient parking lot was barely recognizable. "It's on foot from here," Magnus said. From here turned out to be a narrow tunnel in the rock, with the corroded remnants of a door still visible at the entrance. For about 3 minutes, we walked only by the flashlight Magnus had brought, but then he poked around on the wall, flicked a switch, and the ancient incandescent lights along the corridor lit up, hanging from the ceiling and connected to a thick black cable. Incandescent light bulbs. Wow. Any antique dealer would give a tidy sum for all this equipment. Why would they use this ancient junk? It was completely incomprehensible. After all, it's 100 times easier to track such purchases. There are only so many shops that sell such stuff. What is this place? I followed Magnus, trying to make sense of it. But aside from the apparent antiquity, the tunnel looked unimpressive. A long, arched passageway cut into the rock, just big enough for 2 people, or droids of normal size to fit through. After a few more minutes, we came to another door, which was in relatively decent condition. At least it wasn't rusty, and still hung on its hinges as it should. Magnus pushed it open with an effort, and we stepped inside. It was a rather large hall, carved into the granite. Just like the tunnel, it was equipped with antique furniture and automation of some kind. I'm not much of an expert in these things, but it seemed to me that all this was very ancient, at least 500 years old, from the 21st century, and maybe even older, from the 20th or 19th century. There were some symbols and colored flags, with which ancient states marked their importance and individuality everywhere. I was not versed in them, but judging by one recurring one, a blue and white 4-pointed star, they had something to do with the military. The military, while they still existed for some reason, always liked to use stars as symbols, only with a different number of rays, 4, 5, 6. But all these were trifles compared to what stood in the hall's center. A large angular cabinet, entangled with a lot of wires, with some glass screens, dials, and wide panels of switches. Judging from the numerous panels' blinking lights and indicators, it was some kind of automatic device, but I was at a loss to guess what it might be. "There," Magnus said. "Now we can talk to the leader of our resistance." He walked over to the cabinet and opened one of the metal doors, revealing an ordinary keyboard. I mean, it was ordinary in the sense that it had keys with letters, but so far, I've seen such keyboards only in historical documentaries or encyclopedias and in articles about the history of computing. And then it hit me. It was an ancient computer. Magnus typed something on the keyboard. The machine flashed its indicators furiously, then buzzed, and from the narrow slot next to the keyboard, a paper tape with icons that looked remotely like letters came out. When it stopped, Magnus ripped it off and handed it to me. They were indeed letters, very oddly shaped but still recognizable. ENIAC 28 welcomes a new resistance fighter, Jeremiah. Our ranks are swelling. Soon we will begin the final eradication of the communist contagion and free the world. I stared dumbly at the tape. Almost all the words seemed to make sense individually, but I couldn't put them together into a meaningful text. What is this ENIAC 28, and what is communist? ENIAC has been leading our movement since the beginning, Magnus said. It was he who opened my eyes to the insidious nature of the world's tyranny of machinery. When I found him a few years ago, it turned my world upside down. Together with ENIAC, we devised a plan to bring freedom back to the people. A plan of which you is a part, Jeremiah. I must have looked really stupid. It's a good thing Magnus interpreted it in his own way. I understand your feelings, he said. Good for him. I didn't understand a thing. I had once had a similar insight when I first interacted with ENIAC. It was created by our great ancestors to fight the vile communist contagion that threatened the entire free world. Unfortunately, much time has passed, and with the help of nefarious mechanisms, its old enemies did seize power. However, guided by the great wisdom of ENIAC, we will soon overthrow them, and justice will prevail in the world. And then I realized, or rather, I remembered, that ridiculous cabinet of transistors, vacuum tubes, and gears was an ancient computer created during the war of all against all, when so-called nation-states were at each other's throats for important resources or for meaningless ideas, like this communism Magnus kept mentioning, or the capitalism that was always fighting communism. A war relic, accidentally forgotten in this underground hole when humans and droids got tired of destroying themselves. A crazy ancient computing machine found by a psychotic human, which resulted in them starting this ridiculous bloody crusade in the name of long rotten ideals. However, all crusades were always ridiculous and bloody. Now, there was only one thing left for me to do. Complete the mission. I exploded. Millions of microscopic nanobots, which made up almost half of my synthesized body and functioned like normal human cells, that's why the resistance members couldn't detect them with any scanners, formed a moving dark cloud. While Magnus stared stunned at the remains of my body, the cloud rushed toward the ENIAC. It penetrated it, searching for and destroying contacts between the ancient computer's clumsy elements. Later, the specialists of the safety service will figure out how it managed to gain self-awareness, if, of course, it was it, and not a particularly sophisticated program, and try to restore it in a safe-for-civilization form. Of course, I couldn't do the same thing to Magnus. I mean, physically, I could, of course, but no sane person could kill a human. Not even an experimental new series droid, such as myself.